So I know I showed this picture in the general session, but I just thought it's kind of funny, right? Because it's one of those things where it's, in the physical world, sometimes it's a lot easier to see, right, where the threats are or where your risks are. I just think it's pretty funny, right? Because it's very, very clear when you see this that the gate isn't quite doing its job, right? But it's not so easy. Cybersecurity isn't that easy, right? There's a lot of places where you just can't see these kinds of things, right? So one of the things we'll focus on today, I think you probably saw, is the effective detection. Clearly, detection isn't the only thing we need to do, and that's one of the points that I'll try to make as we go through this. But I also do want to encourage questions, right? Let's make this a discussion if we can, right? If you've got any questions or anything, absolutely, feel free to ask. The most important thing for me is that you get out of it what you need. Now then, well, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Steve Caimi. I do cybersecurity for Cisco, and I focus purely on public sector, not only state and local, but federal government, DoD, civilian, higher education, and so forth. And one of the things that I'm very, very passionate about is bringing best practices. One of the things we're starting to see a lot in state government is alignment with the best practices we see that come out of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, right? Yeah, Gartner has that great framework they showed in the main session, but I think a lot of us realize that from a state strategy perspective, we're starting to align with NIST, right? We've got great best practices not only in terms of the cybersecurity framework, but there's also a comprehensive risk management framework. Is anyone already in the room familiar with some of these frameworks at all? Are you? Okay, some are. But what we'll focus, like I said today, is how do we make detection more effective, right? Finding those risks and actually being able to spot them is not easy at all in cybersecurity, right? I've been doing cybersecurity for close to 20 years. I started my career at Citicorp, trying to protect, 20 years ago, right? We had very simple things to try to protect, right? With some brochureware on Citibank.com, but certainly there was no online banking and things like that. So the stakes, obviously, are a lot higher. What I'm going to do first is I'll go through just a couple of threats detection scenarios and see, I'm not going to ask the question, and if anyone, feel free to raise your hand if you've got feedback on it. But what I wanted to see is, like, in your organization, how would you spot this kind of stuff, right? So imagine a situation here where let's say it's a state government network, and we have, various systems. We have database servers. We have, devices either, wired to the network or potentially, on wireless, right? We've got a firewall and other security controls and so forth. Obviously, we'll be connected to the cloud. And what if we have this database server? Maybe it's the voter registration database, and it normally communicates with these couple of systems. All of a sudden, one day, the voter registration database starts piling a bunch of data going out. So how do you spot that kind of thing in an organization today? Like, how would you know that that's an unusual traffic pattern? Right, sure, maybe you've had some kind of control placed on the firewall that says, hey, don't let certain traffic out. But what if it's using a port that's allowed to communicate through, like standard HTTP type traffic? Right, so I point that out because sometimes that kind of thing is actually very difficult to see without having good detection capabilities. A second one, which I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with, is this advanced malware and things like ransomware and so forth. Malicious code is becoming extremely prevalent, and there's a lot of attack vectors. Right? You can get it just by clicking on the web, right? There's a lot of legitimate websites that use advertising that goes to third parties, and one website can connect to dozens and dozens and dozens of different ad servers. And actually, what's happening now with malvertising is this idea of actually putting malicious code in an ad on a legitimate site, right? And you can download that so easily. And then finally, thanks off. We have things like the email and spear phishing types of attacks. If you look me up on LinkedIn, for example, you could use that information to do a very well-crafted email, right, to come to me and trick me to click on it, right? It's very, very easy to come and do that. So if we have this malicious code, what if you click on it, right, and it simply sits there and lies dormant? Or maybe it comes in multiple different pieces, right? Maybe there's no disposition on this type of malware that says, hey, this thing is actually malicious. Maybe it's just a piece of code that's sitting there and waiting for another piece to come down. Or simply just waiting there for a couple hours or a couple days, right? How do you spot that kind of thing? Or what do you do once it starts acting up, right? Another detection scenario I put out here is you've heard this idea of called botnets. You might have even seen in the news that there was this big Internet of Things botnet. It's the idea of taking a whole bunch of systems and controlling them, right, to either do a denial of service attack against a system or so forth. And your system could be a botnet and you wouldn't even know it, right? So what if you have normal traffic, right? It uses command and control traffic typically uses normal DNS, right, to get out and find the actual attacker, right? What if that command and control, right, starts affecting other systems? How would you know if it's just using legitimate, DNS type traffic or legitimate HTTP traffic? The fourth scenario I was going to throw out here is, obviously we have a lot of, various cloud applications out there. We at Cisco, we have our own, right, cloud applications that we use for official business and so forth. So what if, again, we have that database server, a normal user is able to access it, but then inadvertently or intentionally, maybe he uploads it to some app like Dropbox, right? Maybe that's an unsanctioned app. All of a sudden it's out there, and there's consumer-grade controls around those types of things, right? So if you have a piece of sensitive information out there, how do you spot or know that it's now flown from that cloud application out, right? And then finally, the last detection scenario I was just going to throw out there is this idea of ransomware, right? We hear a lot about this, right? And this is the FBI definition of it, right? It's basically malware that locks up all your critical files, and they basically say, hey, look, you've got X amount of time to pay up, right? Otherwise, we're just going to destroy all of your data. And I don't know about you guys. I tend to sit back and go, well, where were the backup and restore procedures? Where's that stuff tested? But I think all of us know in the real world that doing that in a large scale is very difficult. It's complicated, right? Systems that actually are networked backup could be affected by the ransomware as well. So obviously, it's not that simple. But I just point that out because there are some attacks where it's very clear that you've been attacked, right? It's not always so difficult to see. So against the backdrop of just some of those scenarios, right, I'm sure all of us in the room can come up with many, many more of them. I think probably all of us will agree that it's extremely important for us to be able to reduce that time to detection. We can't go, I think Verizon probably did an overview of their breach report. I don't know what the latest statistic is from that report, but it's probably on the order of 200 days, right, that we can go without actually being able to detect that we've been affected by a breach. So some of the session foundation, right, that I bring to you today is some of the concepts is not only from Cisco's core research. We obviously do our own cybersecurity reports every January and approximately in the summer. We have a team of researchers. These are the guys that actually bake all that intelligence into our security solutions. But they publish the reports on their findings, and part of the session that we have today is based on some of that core research. They also do surveys of practitioners like you to get your insights into things, right? So just wanted to point that out there. And of course, we also wanted to capture some of the essence from Verizon, who was here today. They continually do look into real world breaches, right? They're actually doing these types of in both incidents and non real breach scenarios. They also use additional research type data, non-incident data, and of course a whole bunch of industry collaborators. So you go to the page where they show the collaborators, obviously we at Cisco have contributed to their report. So some of the insights that I'll bring you today is from the breach report as well. And in fact, this is one of the slides that I actually like the most, right? They put out there, this is Verizon, right? They say, Mick was wrong, right? Time is not on your side. Don't make me sing the song. But what they were trying to say was, and this is just a reproduction of their own data from the report. The first thing they pointed out is that the time to compromise, right, the breaches, the percentage of breaches where the time to compromise was in terms of minutes is over 80%, right? That means from the time that an attack launches to the time that that breach was actually successful, in 80% of the cases, it happens in just minutes, right? And then secondly, time to take the data and get it out, right, from the time that that breach was affected, can then be anywhere from just a couple of days, right? Be able to go through the network, find where that sensitive information is, maybe just grab only the sensitive data to not trip alarms, right? And then exfiltrate that data in a matter of days. If it takes 200 days for us to figure out that we've been breached, but this stuff is happening in a matter of minutes, right? And data is being taken out in a matter of days, I think you'll probably agree with us that we all need to do a better job of detecting. So against this backdrop, right, what we're seeing from our report and from other data is that these attacks obviously continue to be effective. And when we point that out, we say, with every new control that we put up, someone finds a way to get around it, right? And I think you heard in the general session today how important it is to coordinate among people, process, and technology. We have to have a coordinated response, right? This fragmented approach is leaving a whole pile of holes for these things to happen. And so finally, we really need that visibility, right? We can't just sit back and hope that we'll detect it, or maybe a partner will detect it for us. We have to be more active in terms of doing integrated threat defense. So I mentioned this is typically where we stop and say, well, okay, what if your agency was going to be breached today? How would you have approached security differently? Let's say you knew that a couple of weeks ago. What would you have done differently? Well, we put a lot of things out there, and if you attended my session here last year, and even I mentioned it in the general session, I'm a big advocate of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Right? It's a framework that's very simple to take and adopt. Right? It's linked against existing best practices. It's not about reinventing the wheel, but it covers these 5 areas. And quite frankly, the framework has become the way I even think about cybersecurity now. What are the controls we need to put in place to first even identify what we have, what assets we have, what are our vulnerabilities, what are our software applications, what are our configurations that we have? We have to know what we have in order to put the proper protections in place, right? Obviously, we want to do all that we can to prevent anything from occurring in the first place. But I think a lot of us will agree that in a lot of cases it's inevitable, right, that something is going to be successful. Some user is going to click on a link, right? Somebody is going to download something, right? So we have to, again, reduce that time to detection. And again, that's the essence of the session today. And respond and recover, right? Once you detect, we have to be able to reduce that time to respond because we already saw how quickly that data can be exfiltrated. And then finally, we have to learn from those, right? So the NIST cybersecurity framework puts up a number of people and process controls around recovery, right? How do we close the loop and learn, from those types of breaches? And like I said, the purpose of the session, I highlighted it earlier, but we'll put it in a little better context in terms of those real-world examples that we talked about. The focus today is about that effective detection. And so this is what the NIST guidance is about. We'll augment that, with some additional information. And like I mentioned, visibility is absolutely the key, right? We mentioned earlier in that first example of just general suspicious traffic patterns. How do we know if there's anomalous activity if we don't even know what the baseline of normal activity is, right? How do we understand that there's malware out there if it's hiding in disguise or hiding in dormant or lying dormant, right, waiting to react later? How do we even know that there's command and control activity? Or how do we get insight, right? With all the encrypted traffic that's on our networks now, I'm sure some of you probably have over 2/3 of the traffic is probably encrypted, maybe higher, maybe 90%, maybe 100%, who knows, right? But how do we know if there's encrypted traffic, where that threats materialize from? So again, I mentioned this, and I'll get to cut to the chase in a little bit here, but it's so important for us to first of all coordinate, right? Again, you heard this earlier today, and I think University of California, UC, mentioned this as well, about how important it is in terms of their priorities in doing that coordinated response among people, process, and technology. And it becomes so important now because of how few cyber experts that we have. There's so many technologies out there. I mean, this conference, how many vendors are here? If you go to the RSA conference, for example, you'll be overwhelmed with vendors. Everybody wants to sell you a box to do something, right? And then finally, we have that people and process technology challenge, but what about our own processes? Does everybody in the organization know what to do when an incident occurs, for example? Right? Processes in terms of testing your backup procedures and things. All right, so you think about that, all of this is a lot easier said than done, which is why sometimes it looks on the surface like, well, it could potentially be hopeless, right? And I advocate that obviously that it isn't. That's one of the reasons why I've been speaking a lot to state and local governments about first adopting the NIST cybersecurity framework, taking a structured approach, assessing your organization against it, and using its process, right, to find out what's putting your organization at risk and where to focus your efforts. Right? It's a very, very good approach. And I don't know if the videos are still available from CSS last year, but I covered how learn and apply, right, the framework, we took it apart. So I think what I would put out here on the table, and I know I mentioned this very briefly in the general session here, is that having truly effective cybersecurity has to be founded on these 3 things. First thing is we have to, and this applies to we in the vendor community as well, we have to make things simple. Right? So simple would be in terms of, so for example, a lot of us when we go and you go to connect to something, you use DNS, right, to go to, I don't know, www.cnn.com, right? Something is going to return an IP address back when you do that. Well, 20 years ago when I was at Citicorp, the DNS server just responded to whatever, right? You ask for a domain, it gives you an IP address. But wouldn't it be amazing if security was actually built into DNS? and said, hey, wait a minute, that was www.cnn.com, and that's a malicious site. So why don't we return a page back to the user saying, hey, this is actually a malicious known domain. And we make it simple for them to do it. And we make it simple for our own administrators to be able to take and plug in, right? DNS is so simple to manage in terms of DHCP and having the router serve that kind of stuff up. And you can do all of that security from the cloud. It's just one example of several, right, about making security simple, right? Something, technologies that can sense the traffic patterns and actually recommend different types of rules, right, on what to do, right? How to, based on the traffic that we're seeing, we recommend that you put these rules in place, right? And based on what we're seeing, here's the impact assessment on what we're seeing, right? That's from a technology approach, we in the vendor community need to do a better job there. And the second aspect I mentioned is about using things like, first of all, open standards, right? We cannot be out there all doing our own thing. Right? We have to be able to leverage these open standards to be able to pull the technologies together, right? And then finally, we need to be able to pull those technologies together and automate our detection and response capabilities. You know, again, I'll focus just on detection here, right? Because that's the focus of the session. Acknowledging that identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover is really the comprehensive set of things that we need to be thinking about. So like I said, the next level down, and I spoke about this very briefly, there's a question in the back.
I want to go back to the issue of open standards.
Absolutely.
How do you feel, I know in hospitals, a lot of the big names, they have their proprietary products, right? Whether it's an imaging machine and what have you, and they definitely don't follow open standards because they want to keep their costs in control. How do you benefit from that? Those are becoming big issues for that.
So the question was about a lot of organizations, like healthcare organizations, don't follow open standards because they're using proprietary technologies, right? They're using those technologies in part to keep costs under control, right? Is that what?
So, for example, if you have a heart monitoring machine,
right?
That's provided through GP, they're following their own standards.
Correct.
Now those are prone to attack because we know they can have
right.
insulin pump machines, heart, all of those.
So the point you're trying to make, obviously, is that a lot of medical devices that are out there use built-in embedded operating systems. They don't necessarily have security built in. There aren't ways to update them, right? But you have to use them. They're FDA certified. They're in use. They're life-saving equipment. So how can we go about still using them but still accomplish these goals? I think one of the things I would put out from that aspect is to use a compensating type of a control approach. So one of the things that we do to compensate for medical devices that are potentially vulnerable is that we use the network itself to segment them off, right? Why even let medical devices talk to anything other than maybe the management system and the database that it needs to go to, right? So if a new threat comes in, a user clicks on some kind of malware, now we've used the network itself to cordon that kind of stuff off. There are definitely ways to accomplish security, right? There's preventative, detective, and compensating type of controls, and I think that's where that comes into play. So like I mentioned, there's these 6 tenets of integrated threat defense, and I wanted to bring them up to you because I think that we can all benefit from this type of approach, right? So if we think about the 6 methods, right, or the benefits you get from using this type of approach, this is what we mean at a high level, right? Providing a richer network and security architecture, recognizing that we can't always just buy what we think is the best-in-class technology, what happens to be in the Gartner Magic Quadrant is the product that we buy for that problem. Third, we have to get visibility, and despite the fact that there's this encrypted activity, we have to be able to understand what it's telling us. Fourth, we have to be able to leverage that openness like I just mentioned, and I'll go into a little more detail there. I think the 5th point is extremely important, right? And this is that idea of using less gear and less software, in part because we just don't have enough people, right? You think in your organizations how many different security technologies you have. You probably have at least 30. And you probably might even have as many as 80, right? How many security administrators and how many screens are they looking at, right? What's the typical day? It's completely overwhelming, right? So we have to do a better job of doing that, and I can share you some approaches to that. And ultimately, right, this approach, the benefit is to be able to speed detection by doing a better job of doing automation, right? So let's take a look at this a little bit, and let's check a time check here because I promised everybody that I wouldn't run over. So we started at 10:20, right? Okay. So let's take a quick look. Right? These slides are a little boring looking. I wanted to tune them up here with a couple of pictures and things, but I didn't. So I'll try to compensate for the lack of interest. So in terms of a richer network and security architecture, wouldn't it be absolutely amazing if the network itself was able to collect that security information and offer insight into what's normal and what's not, right? Without any additional technologies. I'm not talking about throwing an IPS inline here. I'm talking about using actual statistics from the network itself, collecting it on the network itself, and giving that information right away, right? Learns about the environment and shares that threat information with other types of technologies. Doesn't just say, hey, here's an email alert that says there's something potentially suspicious. That's not enough. We can't have an email alert, right? We have to feed that into our automated set of controls so that we can actually drive actionable intelligence. And when I say actionable, it could be actionable by technology, or it could be actionable by people who also understand what process they need to follow, right? So I think ultimately that tenet drives that faster and better threat detection by using what we have available already and not necessarily throwing a box at the problem. Make sense? Secondly, more than just more technology. You know, we in the vendor community love to push boxes, don't we? We come to you, we talk about fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and we say, well, the only way to solve that is to buy this over here and plug it in and make it work, right? But I think what we're recognizing here is it isn't necessarily about best-in-class technology, right? I think what we're actually talking about is being able to use the technologies and the capabilities that we already have to their most maximum, right? I worked for a vendor that did security information and event management. I believe, by talking with many of our customers, that they used probably 8% of its capabilities. They bought this big thing, they thought it was going to do this, and they got it to do this, right? I think you guys understand. And it also, the other aspect about this is that it really does highlight the importance of people and process in this, right? We have to be able to reduce the burden on our people, but at the same time, we have to make sure everybody understands what processes to follow, right? And I also point this out, too, because I've met many, many organizations that overinvest in certain areas. They go very deep, and then they leave this big gaping hole over here, right? That's one of the aspects of the NIST cybersecurity framework that I find extremely compelling, is the fact that you can use that as a way to assess your organization against best practices to help highlight what's actually putting your organization at risk, right? Instead of trying to go really deep in one area and leaving the back door open over here. So I think one of the keys approaches here is to, let's eliminate these gaps, right? A third aspect of this is getting that visibility, and I keep mentioning encrypted traffic because encrypted traffic, everything's encrypted these days, right? Everything, Google searches, I can't even believe, everything. Right, so encrypted traffic is good, but it's also bad, right? Yeah, there's SSL decryption type technology, but it's extremely expensive, it's hard to manage, you can't possibly decrypt everything, right? So one of the things that we're talking about here is that be aware that a lot of security products, right, can potentially be blinded if there's a lot of encrypted traffic type going on. So it really underscores the importance of other types of controls, right? Things like from the network itself, maybe we don't need to look into the payload. Maybe we can just look at the source and destination IP and the ports that are in use. Maybe we can look at the amount of traffic that goes from that voter registration database over to the system that it normally talks to give us insight into what kind of threats are potentially materializing, right? The idea is to be able to use the technology, right? Advanced technology today has capabilities to do machine learning, right? This stuff is real. It wasn't 10 years ago. It is now. Right? And we think we need to all leverage it. A fourth aspect, like I mentioned, is this idea of openness and using open application programming interfaces. Absolutely no one vendor is going to come along and solve all the problems. Right? Multi-architecture solutions are here to stay. But the thing is that we have to make sure no matter what vendor technology we're using, and we have to force our vendors into thinking like this, is to make sure that that stuff shares information. Right? So wouldn't it be amazing if the network detected that the voter registration database is sending a whole pile of information to the firewall and it looks like it's getting through? Wouldn't it be neat if I also sent a signal over to that firewall to cut that traffic off from the IP address because there's no reason for that IP to be talking to the firewall itself? Maybe it just got overlooked in the firewall configuration. Even today, right, it's hard to manage these configurations, and sometimes when you make a change, you can make a change that has an unintended consequence. So if we think about using those types of APIs where one technology senses this, but it sends a signal over here to chop that traffic off and do it in near real time, This is what I'm talking about in terms of effective detection, right? Yeah, maybe I'm getting a little bit into the response angle, but I think it's important to tie those two pieces together, right? So the idea with open APIs is to leverage and connect to these multiple platforms and make them effective, right, by working together. So I mentioned about talking about less gear. I think I made the point. I won't belabor it, but I think you all understand that, and we are saying, right, that this integrated threat defense strategy, if you take it, is this mindset of just not necessarily buying a box and buying more software. Because a lot of times, the more things we buy, the higher the complexity, right? And there's a limit, right, to how much complexity we can take before we're actually, reducing the amount of benefits, right? I think we all understand that concept of, diminishing returns, right? So I think that's one of the things we're trying to put out here is that more things will also make more work for us, right? And if it's not easy for us to manage or integrate, then maybe that's not a great investment, right? Maybe there's another way that we can approach it. And that's why I'm glad that the question in the back came up about potential compensating controls for things like medical devices. There are always situations where we need to continue using legacy stuff, right? Things that was potentially vulnerable, right? But we have to be able to use what we have at our fingertips to be able to manage that. The last aspect is to rely on that automation. We have to take the burden off security analysts, not only because we don't have enough. Secondly, how many security analysts tend to stay in that SOC job, right? I don't know about you, but sitting in a SOC looking at UIs all day long and trying to look at these different UI, it's not very career fulfilling, at least from my perspective. It's unfortunate that that's on video, but it's true, at least for me, right? I think these guys want to eventually graduate. They want to get into different things. So what happens? We get the next wave of security analysts. They just came out of the educational program, and they're green, right? So who do we actually have in the SOC looking at all this stuff, right? We have too few of them. There's not enough professionals. We all understand that we have to start relying on automation. Recently, the Department of Homeland Security put out what was called EASE, the Enterprise Automated Security Environment. It's a concept. It sounds a lot like the self-defending network from 10 years ago. They're working with partners like us, right, to be able to actually make enterprise automation a reality. And it is, right? It takes a little bit of pulling together, but it certainly is a reality. And certainly we here at Cisco can share with you, a lot of insights, more than what I could possibly cover here. But I think the mission at the end of the day for effective threat detection against today's landscape is that we have to be able to take that corrective action. We have to do it automatically, and we actually have to make sure our people and process controls support it. We can't be waving our arms around saying, oh, our configuration management team won't allow that, right? Where's the change control ticket? Maybe we can automate that, right? Maybe the integrated threat defense sends a signal over to the IT service management system that says, hey, I just updated the firewall, and here's the rule, right? You get the idea. So if I take this and I apply it to the various scenarios, right? I think about that first scenario where you have that voter registration database that's sending a whole pile of information out, right? I mentioned this. Wouldn't it be amazing if the network itself sensed that, it saw the hole in the firewall rule, right? It sent a note to the firewall to say, hey, chop that traffic off, or maybe even better. Maybe it doesn't mess with the firewall at all. Maybe the network itself could say, hey, I know that packets from this source IP address should never go that direction. And in fact, we know that these series of IP addresses make up our voter registration database system. So that group should never talk to that group over there, right? And put that policy in place and do it automatically, right? Maybe that wasn't configured initially, but that's one way that the integrated threat defense approach can solve problems like this, right? And again, potentially update IT service management so that a human being knows what change actually occurred. If something does actually go wrong, you can go back to the ticket and make the change. I talked about things like this evasive malicious code. This is really, malicious code is scary stuff, right? Especially today where it can come and use different types of technologies. It's called polymorphism, which actually goes and changes. Then all of a sudden it becomes malware. It starts acting up, starts to spread through the organization. So I think what we're saying is that first of all, we have to do the best job that we can with that point in time to try to stop malware, right? There's a lot of threat intelligence around the types of malware that's out there, right? So we obviously have to make that point in time decision. But at the same time, we have to track that stuff through the network, right? One of the approaches that we can take is for a file that comes into the organization, for example, and we don't necessarily know its disposition, you have to allow it. We can't stop business, right? But what we could do is take a hash of that file and store it and continue to monitor what it does, right? And if we find that that file starts acting up or has connected with something else, wouldn't it be amazing if we track that through the organization and we now know all 15 systems that have that malware on it and chop it off, right? That's, again, what I'm talking about in terms of doing things like automating this and taking a continuous, type of approach for things like malicious code. I mentioned things like the botnet command and control. It uses DNS, right? So there's a lot of ways that we can use this. We can use the network itself to be able to see this type of traffic, right? This port 53 traffic from a million different systems that ordinarily don't talk to the internet. The system never talked on port 53 before. Port 53 has DNS. Does everybody know that? Okay, just checking. So DNS traffic, what if an IoT system never uses port 53, right? Maybe it uses these 5 ports and never 53. Right, so I think I'm mentioning like using the network itself to be able to sense that kind of stuff, right? As routers and switches look at an IP packet, it can see clearly what the destination IP or destination port is, right? And we know what system it's come from, right? More than just more technology, obviously researchers and ISPs, we can all do a better job on collaborating on threat response. I think we do that a lot now in terms of like thwarting distributed denial of service attacks and so forth, but we at Cisco, we continue to share our information. We participate in the multi-state ISAC and so forth. So in terms of sharing that and more than just technology. If you see a spike in SSH volume, for example, that's that encrypted type of traffic. Again, that's what I'm talking about in terms of integrating threat defense and having a better insight and to be able to stop that kind of botnet traffic, right? We can use our technologies today. Cloud applications, wouldn't it be great if we had a way to hook into the existing APIs? Most legitimate cloud applications have APIs that offer visibility, right? There's a lot of technologies out there today that are cloud-based that you can take, plug into those APIs, and put policy around it and say who can access what, who's allowed to upload what, and what data did get uploaded. In fact, we at Cisco do that ourselves, right? So there's a lot of ways that we can actually go and track through cloud access security brokers. I think that's a Gartner term, for this market. Right, to be able to understand what's being put in the cloud and what isn't. This is a big problem, not just for sensitive information, but we heard about healthcare, in the back. There's healthcare providers right now who are uploading, protected health information to like Dropbox. I don't know if they're doing it on purpose or not, but there are real Office of Civil Rights violations in terms of hundreds of thousands of dollars that get assessed when they find HIPAA violations like that, right? So it's not just about, protecting the data, it's also protecting yourself against potential huge fines. And so finally, I jokingly put the ransomware scenario out there. I think the best advice I have about ransomware is look in the protect function in the NIST cybersecurity framework. There's a whole section that goes about information backups and how to test them and so forth. A lot of good best practices around that. I know that's challenging, but it's extremely important, in today's world. One of the approaches, and I don't mean to make this a Cisco, commercial again, and I promise not to be, but if you can take a set of technologies to help protect against ransomware and do it in an integrated way, that's one of the approaches that we're taking in order to help, right? We all know that the backup problem is going to continue for a long time, so why don't we have a better way to be able to do not only the stopping of malicious code, which ultimately becomes ransomware, but also stop it from getting any worse, right? So from an integrated threat defense strategy, I just wanted to very quick wrap up here with an alignment. Again, probably every single day I talk to somebody about the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? When it first came out, I wasn't quite a believer until I actually dug in and figured out its power. So if you haven't had a chance, go to nist.gov/cyberframework, check it out. Obviously, it covers these 5 functions. And when you get into the detect function, there's 3 areas that they recommend focusing on. First one is looking at that anomalies and events, right? Remember we talked about that detection scenario 1, where we have a voter registration database and it's all of a sudden it's sending a pile of information in one direction. There's a lot of information and best practices to be found, right? And this already links back to NIST 800-53, right? So if you want to go and dig into what they're saying about anomalies and events, I think most of us know that that security control catalog, NIST 800-53, provides all that additional information and those control enhancements to figure out what to do there. Secondly, that continuous monitoring, right? So important. The federal government's been talking about this for a long time. Again, I think it's NIST 800-137. That's a whole publication on information security continuous monitoring. All right. No one wants to read a whole NIST publication on that topic, but if you look at just the section within the cybersecurity framework about doing continuous monitoring, right, I think you'll find that has some of the key points that need to be made there. All right, in the last 5 minutes, finally, it talks about the importance of the detection processes. When something happens, how many organizations have an organized plan and know exactly what needs to be done? What needs to be documented? Who do we communicate with, right? What response do we take, right? All those detection processes and procedures, testing them, right? Those are some of the things that they point out. So the detect function in the cybersecurity framework really highlights the three of these. And I think during the course of our presentation, I won't spell it all out for you, again, because I think we covered a lot of this, where the 6 tenets of that integrated threat defense strategy, right, to do better detection, really supports all of these types of concepts. If anyone would love to talk, I could talk for you all day about this kind of stuff, so I won't. But I think you get the idea, right? So again, just to summarize in the last couple of seconds, we have to do that obviously better job, not only reducing that time to detection, but also that time to respond, right? It's one thing just to detect and go, oh gosh, someone's running off of my TV. There he goes. We have to respond, obviously, at the same time. So we have to do both. And that's integrated threat defense strategy. If you take this kind of mindset and realize these kind of benefits, I think across all state and local government, I think any organization can benefit from this mentality and applying it and demanding the things that we talked about from your security vendors as well, right? So to learn more, right, I talked a little bit about, Cisco's threat researchers and things. These are the guys that have all the brains behind all the, the research into the malware, and how they bake all the important stuff into the technologies that we sell. It's actually a group called Talos, right? And if you go to talosintelligence.com, they constantly blog about all the latest threats and what's done to bring down, SSH psychos and all these different types of things. So it's a great place to get a good sense of where, what's going on in the world. They share a ton of information out there. Secondly, I think I mentioned a number of NIST best practices, including the cybersecurity framework. If you haven't already, the NIST Computer Security Division has something called the CSRC, or the Computer Security Resource Center. That's where they put all their special publications. It's where they put the FIPS publications. Just about any topic you can think of, it has some kind of guide, right? They recently put a new incident recovery, guide out there. They have a draft guide for threat information sharing. There's a ton of great information to be found there. And even if all you do, is kind of skim through it and pull out what you need, it's a great place to get that. We at Cisco, obviously, we have a table here. We'd love to talk with you. Yvonne, my peer, is here as well. Certainly, we'd love to talk with you a lot more about how we can do it. Our table is over there in the corner. And then some of the security reports in that integrated threat defense approach, and a lot more, right, could be found if you just go to cisco.com/security report. Right? Again, we publish that every approximately 6 months, and I can't resist Halloween. We're 4 weeks away from Halloween. But an integrated treat defense, Now that, I don't know, I couldn't resist that, right? So I think that takes us to the end here. I really appreciate everyone's time. What questions do we have?
When you were talking about
So his question was, what he asked was, he felt that, he's asking whether I felt that it was pointless to try to even decrypt the traffic at all, right? Because of all the extra gear that's required, it's a lot of manpower, it's expensive. The first thing I would put out there is, like anything, it's a risk-based decision for your organization, right? In my house, I probably shouldn't say this on video, but I don't have an alarm system, right? It's a risk that I've taken personally, right? Because I don't feel like I need to invest based upon where I live and my neighborhood and things like that, right? I feel it's safe enough. We make sure we lock the doors, right? We feel like there's an appropriate set of controls. I think the point that I'm really trying to make here, though, is that there is a lot of information to be gleaned if you look for it and you use the right capabilities without necessarily having to decrypt it, right? Like I said, I mentioned this on the main stage. Even if you look at things like call detail records, right? You got a source phone number, a destination phone number, how long the call took. You can extract a lot of information about potentially suspicious activity around what people do. There's a very similar type of approach. It's called NetFlow, right? That the network traffic does. You can get that information, and if you analyze and process it and look for baselines and look for spikes, right? Look for unusual protocols, you can find all that stuff in the IP header without having to decrypt all the payload. So I think I'm just trying to put out there two things. The first thing is, why not take the most advantage that you can without doing the decryption? And then make that risk-based decision, for your agency or your organization on whether you feel it's important enough and where to actually try to decrypt. Does that answer the question? Sorry, it's a little longer. I usually try to keep things short. I was only 7 minutes in there. 7 minutes. Yeah. But the thinly veiled marketing approach here, obviously, is to say that we at Cisco can advise not only on all whether and how, right, how to adopt the framework and so forth, but we've got the capabilities to support everything that we talked about here. I just didn't want to club you over the head with this product does this and this product does that and all that. But certainly we can, and everything I mentioned here is real. What other questions do we have? I think we're probably out of time, but thank you so much for coming. I hope you got something out of it, and hope the rest of the day goes well. Again, really appreciate the time.